Wael often wonders when he'll walk again. He was injured in Syria and had to flee. But here in Lebanon, he can't get the help he needs.
I can't just go to any hospital. Not all doctors accept me, and treatment is expensive here. We can't even pay for a taxi to get to a hospital in Tripoli. I can't even afford one session of physiotherapy.
More than 1,000 Syrians live in this camp in Tripoli and rely almost entirely on aid. For more than 4 years, many have struggled to build a new life. Syrian refugees in Lebanon must apply for residency. Last year, the government scrapped a $200 fee for refugees registered with the UNHCR. But since then, more than 60% of Syrian asylum seekers have lost their legal status. Without it, they can't get jobs and risk being detained. Khaled is one of many Syrians who lives with that fear. He says the price for safety in Lebanon was his freedom.
Not long ago, I crossed a checkpoint and ended up in jail for a few days. I had to keep going back to Beirut to renew my residency, but now they told me to leave the country. Where did they expect me to go? I don't even have 10 lira to feed my family.
Down the road is where loved ones are buried. Refugees are told there's no room in the cemeteries. Proper tombs are expensive. Even in death, they struggle to find their place. Lebanon's government says the country is at breaking point. Syrian refugees make up 1 in every 4 people, and the economy is being squeezed. It's thought the Syrian conflict has cost Lebanon nearly $18 billion. Some Lebanese business owners, like Mervet, are frustrated.
Now there are too many shops, and Syrians offer lower prices. Many Lebanese businesses also choose to hire Syrians instead of locals because they cost less.
But the only jobs on offer for Syrians are in cleaning, agriculture, or manufacturing. We're inside an industrial zone in Beirut's suburbs. There's around 70 factories here, and around 300 Syrians, mostly refugees, work and live here. Jamel has worked as a mechanic in Beirut for 17 years. He's noticed a change in how people treat him. He thinks it's because he's Syrian.
Before the war, I used to get $40 to $50 a day. After the war, I've been getting paid $10, maybe $20. I accept the work anyway, so I don't fall into debt. But I live in a garage.
Lebanon cannot continue and will not continue to sustain the consequences of hosting 1.5 million displaced on its territory.
The government says it needs $10 billion in aid to rebuild infrastructure and continue putting hundreds of thousands of Syrian children through school. But it also wants to start sending people back to Syria.
There are safe areas with the regime, and there are safe areas with the anti-regime forces where these Syrians can go instead of keeping flooding to Lebanon. We are trying to limit this, and to try to deal with it at our best, but this is not something that is easy.
Many Syrians dream of returning home, but few here want to take that risk before the war ends. In that time, an entire generation will have grown up in camps, many out of school and with no sense of where home is. Sandra Gatman in Beirut, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now from Beirut by Bassam Khawaja. He's a researcher, Lebanon researcher at Human Rights Watch, and Middle East analyst Halim Shebaya from the Lebanese American University. Thanks, gentlemen, for joining us. Halim, let me start with you. The Lebanese army evicting refugees, is that the right thing to do?
I mean, the Lebanese army evicting refugees, if it was done in the proper way and if there were valid security reasons and if it was communicated in the right way, then perhaps there would be a discussion about it. But as far as I know, the eviction took place in a way that caused a lot of outcry among activists and among the residents of the camps that were evicted, especially given the very short time limit that they were given to evacuate. I believe it was 2 days or 3 days. And a lot of these refugees had already moved, and a lot of them, as a result of that eviction, lived in dire conditions, as reported by organizations and activists who were working in these camps. So in that sense, I think, in my opinion, it wasn't the right movement, especially in the way it was done, and especially because there wasn't any alternative given to these evicted residents. Where do they go next after being evicted from these camps?
Right, Bassam, so it could have been okay if it was done properly, but it was not done properly. Do you agree with that?
It really depends on what the justification the army has given for the evictions. As you know, in Lebanon, refugees aren't in official camps, and so they have to get their own accommodations. And this is really the largest eviction we've seen on this type of scale, 10,000 people being evicted and really just given a few days to find alternative accommodations. This means, that they, in many cases, have to stop sending their children to school. They're cut off from work and being able to support their families. And as the situation gets worse and worse in Lebanon, where about 70% of refugees now live below the poverty line, they really don't have the financial means to be moving and starting a new life yet again. And for some of these refugees, this is maybe the third or fourth time they've been evicted. And so we're very concerned about the announcement that came down a few weeks ago.
Halim, as things stand, do you sympathize with the Lebanese government that it has this massive problem? I mean, more than a quarter of its population has increased with the Syrian refugees coming in. I took that same figure and I transposed it to the United States, increasing the population by 25%. That would mean 83 million people going to the United States. Do you have sympathy with the authorities that they just don't know how to handle this?
Well, I have sympathy with the Lebanese people and with the Syrian refugees. I have an understanding about the gravity of the situation that the government has to deal with. But in my opinion, the government has been incompetent in dealing with the Syrian refugee situation. And especially recently, the Syrian refugees have been used as a scapegoat by different parties, not just one party in government, to warn about the security threats and to warn about the economic situation, and without offering alternatives and without even having a clear policy that takes into account the various needs of the Syrian refugees as well as the host communities. So in that sense, I have an understanding that Lebanon is passing in a refugee crisis. It's huge, as you mentioned, in terms of on a per capita basis. I think it's the largest country that hosts refugees. But using refugees as scapegoats in political discourse does not help the refugees, does not help the government, does not help Lebanon as a whole.
Bassam, are they being used as scapegoats?
Absolutely. We're seeing a large amount of demonization of the refugees by politicians, as well as troubling rhetoric that's increased over the past year about deportation of Syrians back to Syria, which would be illegal under international law. Look, there's no question that Lebanon has taken on an enormous burden, hosting about 1.5 million Syrians in this country, the largest per capita in the world. And they've really put larger and richer countries to shame in doing so. But they've also enacted very problematic policies, such as the residency policy for Syrians here, that have made it very difficult for Syrians to survive and have made the political situation much more difficult.
Yeah, Bassam, this sounds almost like the old argument used towards Palestinian refugees, those in the refugee camps from way back when, right? It's like, if we give you more rights, then you might stay forever and you can't go back to your homeland. Are we seeing the same thing playing out here?
Absolutely, and it was really with the Palestinian experience that led Lebanon to make the decision, unlike Jordan and Turkey, not to open refugee camps, but at the same time not to allow them to work and make it very difficult for them to maintain legal status in the country, which again makes it impossible for them to support their families. And so coming out of that experience of the last 50, 60 years, really I think the Lebanese government is shooting itself in the foot with this policy. It's making it much more difficult for the refugees to support themselves and for the Lebanese government to maintain control over the situation.
Halim, Saad al-Hariri, the Prime Minister, saying the international community should provide Lebanon with $10 to $12 billion over the next 7 years. And that sounded good, but then sort of in the next sentence, he basically suggests that if you don't, we can't keep them. How do you interpret that?
Yeah, I mean, it could have been a negotiating technique or as part of his sales pitch to try to convince them to give the funds that he's requesting. But I think it's very dangerous to use that language of we can't keep them, especially since there was a petition 3 or 4 days ago sent to the U.S. State Department and to the U.S. Senate by a number of Lebanese people. Its title was, let the Syrian refugees leave and let them go to safe zones. And unfortunately, this type of rhetoric, and that Prime Minister Hariri said when he says that we can't keep them, treats refugees, and excuse the terminology I will use, it's almost as if we're treating refugees as an inconvenient piece of furniture in the house that we don't know where to place, and then we're just saying, well, you know, give us the money or give us somewhere to put them, and then it's just treating them as an entity with that just has to be dealt with, very much demonizes and also dehumanizes their situations, and doesn't really help the country, because as we well know, there's a lot of controversy and a lot of debate about the how efficient and how suitable safe zones are in this period. And a lot of rights organizations and a lot of humanitarian organizations, such as the Norwegian Refugee Council, have said that it's not really the right step to take in this at this point in time. So I don't think this language of we can't keep them does not really help them. It does not help the government. It has no it has no tangible effect on the ground, basically.
Bassam, there have been trash protests, there have been corruption protests, people are unhappy with their economy. To what extent, Bassam, is the refugee crisis linked to the economic squeeze on Lebanon? To what extent can we connect the two?
Sure. So there are no real numbers on how the Syrian refugees have affected the Lebanese economy. What we have seen is really the presence of so many Syrians has exacerbated problems that have existed in Lebanon for decades now. And so we see this with waste, we see this with the healthcare, we see this with education. The education system in Lebanon was weak way before this presence of the Syrians in the country. But at the same time, we're seeing Syrians being scapegoated and blamed for these pre-existing conditions that politicians simply don't want to deal with and have not dealt with in the proper way for the past few decades now.
Okay, Halim, they call you in the room, the Prime Minister, the President, and the Speaker. They say, Halim, in a sentence, how can we make this better? What would you tell them?
Well, I'll tell them the Syrian refugee or the Syrian refugee crisis has to be seen as an opportunity, because in my opinion, the whole discourse that we're seeing is just a symptom of the many problems that Lebanon is facing. Lebanon doesn't have we should have had parliamentary elections 4 years ago, and now even this year we might not have them. There are so many problems. It should be used as an opportunity to basically put a policy for the long term to how to deal with the refugees, how to deal with Lebanon's internal problems, and with a focus on really asking the right questions rather than asking always how to deal with the refugee crisis, asking the more important question that we can do something about and that the President and the Prime Minister can do something about. Basically the question being, how can we improve the state of affairs in Lebanon? How can we improve the governance? How can we fight corruption? How can we improve the services and the infrastructure? And when you do that, I think there will be a positive spillover on dealing with the refugee crisis.
Okay. Incredible situation in Lebanon. And of course, everybody hopes the war in Syria next door ends, which is the root cause of all the trouble in the region at the moment, it seems. Bassam Khawaja and Halim Shebaya, it's been a pleasure having both of you on the program. Thanks so much for joining us.